Welcome. My name is Manuel. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration here on the campus. I'm going to say a few words to get us started and get this conversation going. First thing is to preface that my voice may not project that much. I have a speech condition which gets treated once a month with Botox. Because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. It looks so damn good. So let me just say a word about Harry to get started, and then maybe just a couple of comments to get the conversation going. So many things are said about Harry in terms of his intelligence and acumen, in terms of his political vision. I just want to acknowledge, and I think all in the room feel it, and to his family, that he was one of the most intellectually generous, professionally generous, and personally generous people you'd never run into in the academy. He gave credit to many people for ideas he probably thought of or spawned. He made sure that folks who were a little bit younger, and at one point I was, were recognized and brought up and paid attention to. So that was his professional generosity, and I think anybody who spent any time with him in the way that he was so graceful with people recognized his personal generosity as well. So the family certainly misses him in a way that none of us can even know, but those that knew him on those other levels miss him deeply as well because of that generosity. So again, thank you for sharing him with so many of us, and thank him for the way he shared things. I was struck on the last panel by a couple of things. One is this notion of the anti-immigrant wave and how it triggers anxiety, but also triggers Latino identity. On the anxiety thing, there's a great book by Gustavo Arellano, the guy who writes the column in OC Weekly, Ask a Mexican. Like you can ask a Mexican anything, right? And the book is about Orange County, and he talks about visiting his father in the first chapter, and his dad is down at Winchell Donuts, right, visiting with the other viejos, right, who are also retired. And he says, I've met the Mexican future, it's banal, right? Sort of, it's not anything to really worry about. But what this anti-immigrant hysteria does do is create an interesting sense of identity. I've always said, my family is Cuban, that before, we grew up in California though, that before Prop 187, my dad was Cubano. After that, he was Latino, right? He felt the sense of being attacked. And one of those things that has led to that attack is not really recognizing the mobility that occurs over time, the changes that take place over time. And one of the things that I think Harry and the TRPI were extraordinarily good at is taking a look at not the snapshot of where we are right now, but the future of where we will be. Taking a look at educational change over time and thinking about those educational opportunities. Taking a look at the economic change and understanding that people who come to the country and start off poor are not destined to remain there if we have the right public policies in place. Taking a look at issues like the digital divide and how you can really overcome that. And actually taking a look at things that many people didn't think about. I mean, I think many of you remember Harry's pioneering projects on foreign policy and the idea that Latinos would eventually develop a kind of notion of what a foreign policy is as well. This is incredibly important for the country because while the big demographic statistic that came out of the last census was that Latinos are 16.3% of the population now. The Latino population growth between 2000 and 2010 was 43%. The non-Hispanic white population growth was 1%. It's a big difference. 42% actually. But the statistic that's actually the most striking from the census, and the one I would think everybody should really be paying attention to, is that the median age, the age at which half the folks are older, half the folks are younger, for non-Hispanic whites is 42. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders is 35. The median age for African Americans is 32, and the median age for Latinos is 27. Wow. 42, 27. It's a generation gap, and it also explains where the population growth is going to be coming from. Because when you're 42 years old, that is not prime family formation age. It might be if you were Newt Gingrich and you keep reforming your family. Sorry, I just can't resist. But if you're 27, you're in prime family formation age, that's that sort of native-born generation coming through. And it also means that this, as Henry was saying, is the future we're taking a look at. So we really couldn't do better than to have this panel, which tends to be extraordinarily future-looking in terms of its ideas and issues. And I want to start with my good friend Dowell Myers, who is here at the SelfEsteem School and is constantly looking at the future, and also reminds us that even if we're 27 now, we may get older later.
Well, that's a very open question you just gave me.
Well, actually, I could ask you a question, but I knew you would answer however you wanted, so I thought I would spare us the pretense and just let you go.
Well,
I think you were going to talk about future trajectories.
there's so many possibilities. You know, the thing is that the one thing about being a demographer is that we do predict the future remarkably well, better than any economist in the room.
I should note that I'm an economist.
Well, except the Federal Reserve, you know, now has said we're just going to make it easy for you guys. We're going to tell you what the interest rates are a year ahead because you can't predict them. But demographers can think 10 years ahead, and that's what we focus on. We don't know next year, but we know 10 years. Because in 10 years' time, everybody in the room here will be 10 years older. And I know it's not funny, but it's sad. But it's a basis for prediction. And every immigrant will be 10 years longer residing. The problem is this: in the immortal words of Tip O'Neill, you know, our former Speaker of the House. I used to live in Boston. All politics is local. And also, I would add, in my immortal words, all politics is today. That's the problem. We know this is all going to change, but they're making decisions today really based on what they saw yesterday and what they imagined from 10 years ago. Many people just don't even know what the current picture is. I am shocked myself as a professional. When I look at the data, I'm surprised. And I'm surprised the average citizen out there, all they know is what the other political activists tell them. And they tell them lies from 1990. And I think that's true. So we have a real problem with perception and understanding. You know, the last panel was just great. I mean, they answered all our questions except for education, which my two colleagues on the other side here will get to the education. Really, that is the engine of the future. It really is. But the problem is we can't get there from here because we're stuck here making decisions, cutting budgets, because we're desperate today and ignoring the future. Secretary Cisneros really was eloquent in his statements, and I totally convinced me. The problem being that I don't know, is that true? Are these people really going to turn out well? I mean, we definitely depend on them, but are they going to turn out well? Because look at the poverty rate. These new immigrants show up today, just humor me, will you? These immigrants show up today, and 30% are poor. I mean, that's terrible. The average, you know, native-born, you know, white American is like maybe 15% poverty. So that we're importing poverty, and it's just going to get worse. It's a burden. And you said these numbers are so big. That's a burden. That's a huge burden. And I don't know what I'm going to do about it. I'm just going to vote no on everything. You tell me anything I can say no on, I'm going to vote no. That's a sentiment that's out there and easily activated by political opportunists who want to get the vote behind them. So I have another variable that I like to look at, another indicator, which instead of 30% poverty, I try to argue that Latinos, 20% are homeowners. The trouble is homeownership is lower than poverty, so that's not going to win very much. And I know Secretary Cisneros cares about homeownership. I learned a lot about it from him. He really was a prime mover in the 1990s. But 30% is bigger than 20. Well, fortunately, being a demographer, I have census data. And so I can go back and look over time, and I can figure out that 30 years later, what's going to happen to the poverty rate. And the poverty rate goes down from 30% down to 18%. So, and then I hear this thrown back in my face, and people say, well, yeah, but 18% is still real high. It's still higher than native-born. And then I'm thinking like Harry Pachon, well, we just got to tell them the facts. Okay, it's 18%. It's high. But look at homeownership. And the interesting thing is, in the immigration debate, homeownership has been off the table. Why? because the restrictionists don't use that variable. It doesn't support their story. And they don't use it, and then the people who fight the restrictionists, they don't use it either. Because the terms of the debate are set by the restrictionists who go first and say, we're protesting. And I know TRPI did one study just a few years ago on homeownership that was pretty important. But not enough gets done. It doesn't get picked up in the media. So what does happen in homeownership? After 30 years, homeownership of Latino immigrants is 60%. Oh, it's still short of native born a little bit. It's still short by 10 or 15% short of native born. It's not all the way equal, but 60% is 3 times greater than when it started at 20%. And 60% is more than 3 times greater than poverty. So what's the real story about the future of Latinos? Is it poverty, which is a high number to begin with? Or is it homeownership, which is a low number to begin with? Or is it homeownership 30 years down the road? And this has been true in every decade, a pretty constant upward mobility in every decade. Because again, back to my basic math, I know that these immigrants aren't just being here 30 years longer, they're also 30 years older. And homeownership accumulates over your lifetime. You move into it gradually and you hold on to it with some setbacks. The last few years have been very bad. But the setbacks, I noticed in my study for the Center for American Progress, we looked at it closely. The setbacks do not reverse progress from 2000. They're still above the 2000 level for people who are moving up, and they drop back a little bit. And now the good news is, it's bad news and good news. It's bad news for all the home sellers, but it's great news for all the home buyers. I mean, prices have been really knocked down. Interest rates are rock bottom. And I think it makes it even easier than ever for immigrants to buy into homeownership, which is the American dream. And Latinos show this extraordinary drive to do that. It's not just a sign of their economic success. It's a sign of their character and a sign of their commitment to living in America. And I think it's the key indicator that should be focused on, not poverty, but homeownership. And we don't do enough with it. So I think that's the one I look at as the best way of looking at the future. In terms of potential, it's clear-cut. Potential is huge. And there are some barriers we need to remove, and one of them is education. I'm going to maybe pass the baton here to my education colleagues, just with one fact from the census data, that the average price offered by a Latino immigrant in California depends on how much education they have. If you compare them to a high school grad, the young immigrant kid who grows up, goes through our education system, gets a degree, a BA degree, and then buys a house, offers a price typically 64% higher than the high school grad. So I always say, who do you want to have come knocking on your door when you're selling your house? Please, I hope it's the kid I invested in early on. I hope it's the kid I paid more taxes for so we'd have a better education system. Please, I want that kid to come knocking on my door. Not the one I tried to cut off because I was being penny pinching 20 years ago. And so we have to develop scenarios that people can imagine ahead of time because they're making these political decisions in the present and we're not feeding them enough information to help them to make better informed decisions. So I think that's where I think about the mission of TRPI and Harry. It includes all these aspects of Latino progress and potential and voting, and all this comes together here on this issue of helping people think ahead and make the right decisions today. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dowell. So I think that lifts up 2 things. One is it's totally consistent with the positive, future-oriented vision that Harry was trying to put forward with TRPI. And second, it validates the fact that I didn't actually need to ask you a question. I'm glad you might move in that direction. And thanks for, it's interesting, I've kind of learned whether there's any jokes about demographers. There certainly are about economists, like if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion. Someone else said if you laid them all end to end, that would be a good thing.
Demographers are always prepared.
Well, I think at the reception later we will be telling jokes about each other's disciplines. So let's move now to one of the things that TRPI focused on, and it's actually key to whether or not Dowell and Harry's positive vision comes true, is education. and the achievements of Latinos in education. There are still huge disparities, huge challenges out there, and we've asked Maria Estela Zarate from UC Irvine to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. The educational status of Latinos definitely played a very prominent role in TRPI's research agenda. And I think a lot of that was due to not only because those of us that research it care about it, but also because consistently polls and surveys demonstrate that Latino parents place a lot of priority on the education of their children, which is contrary to a lot of the restrictionist discourse that we hear. But from what we know from surveys, they place great value on education. They prioritize it in ways that maybe they're not familiar to us, but in ways that are familiar to them. And they seek higher education for their children. And so then Harry would explain our goal as researchers and as policy research specifically, was that we had to point the problems, the gaps, the issues to policymakers, then also provide a reason for why those gaps existed, and then provide solutions. And that was, if we were to look back at the agenda of TRPI and all of the reports that came out, that's consistently what it did. It would pick up a popular topic right now, for example, the banning of ethnic studies in Tucson, that's currently going on. You pick a hot topic, explain what were the issues, the reasons behind it, and offer a solution. With that work, I think TRPI answered a lot of important questions that sort of map out the history of Latinos in education. He would ask questions such as, do students of color have access to AP courses in high schools? Do Latino parents lack information about preparing their children to go to college? Is bilingual education a good thing or not? We all remember that huge battle in the 90s. And what happened to student of color enrollment at University of California after Prop 209? So, for many of those of us in the education business, the most important outcome that we seek for all students is a college education. And the reason that Adele gave about home buying is one of many reasons. We see benefits in health outcomes and across a broad array of related benefits of a college education. And ultimately, I think for most of us, especially those of us that grew up with immigrant parents, we see it as a gateway to social mobility. And for me, I personally can't imagine being where I am without having had a college education. So about a decade ago, or maybe a little bit more, TRPI started documenting the enrollment of students of color at UCs. This was important because UCs in the state of California are prominent institutions. We also know that students that enroll in more selective institutions, especially students of color, tend to have better life outcomes in the long run than those that don't. Thus, it was very important to document how students of color have had access to University of California, especially after the banning of affirmative action. So with that legacy in mind, and because I have your attention here, so I'm going to demonstrate what a graduate student and I have been doing following Harry's example of documenting access to the University of California. And we've looked at these trajectories over a 15-year span. And besides documenting the enrollment of students at UC, we're also looking at where along this pipeline of gaining admissions to a UC are some of the problems that we see. And so one of the things that became most apparent was that over the past 15 years, there has been no change in the representation of students of color among eligible students. So for me, this speaks about what we're doing in high school and how we're preparing students. Now, in the last 5 years, some school districts have implemented measures so that all students will graduate eligible for UCs, but clearly it hasn't made a dent yet in the statewide figures. So, of the students that do graduate who are eligible to go to UCs, why are they not applying? Is another question that we see. Why are they not represented among the applicants to UCs? And what I'm measuring here is the representation of students within a reference population. So this is not all 18 to 24-year-olds in California, but rather from the previous reference population. So what we see here is that Asian American students are about over 50% more likely to apply to a UC among those that are eligible, but for some reason the other groups are not. And who gains admissions? So this is where we see probably the most graphic effect of Prop 209. And if you see the dip between 97 and 98, that's the implementation of Prop 209. And what we then see is a non-recovery. There hasn't been a recovery in the representation of students of color at UC admissions over, the way that we were expecting there to be a recovery at some point when high schools caught up in preparing students. Then what was really confusing to us is when students were admitted, there was clearly a difference in pattern in who accepted these offers of admissions. So that even though, for some reason, there's Asian American students are much more likely to accept an offer of admissions at UC than other groups. So for me, that tells us that we still have some work to do. But in the spirit of Harry, I'm also going to offer some questions about, for those of you that are here for a captive audience, and what sort of direction, not only in research, but in intervention this points to. One is that preparation for college is essential, and it starts early on. And it is problematic, I think, that we politically haven't addressed this at the high school level, and question why the rate of students who are prepared to enroll at UC has not increased over 15 years. It also speaks to the fact that a lot of students are not applying to UCs even though they are eligible. Also speaks to how we have been cutting budget funds for recruitment and for outreach programs in the past 15 years. I don't know if you remember in 2002, when Arnold Schwarzenegger first came into power. That was one of the first major cuts that he did, is cut a lot of the outreach programs. And the reasoning behind that was that no corporation should spend that much money on marketing. And although for-profit colleges spend much more than what we had allocated to recruitment, I think one of the effects is that it doesn't, for those of us that do work in this area, we cannot understand why students who are eligible are not applying to college.
Could you tell me what that means? Does that say that Latinos, a higher percentage is going into UCs than of whites?
No, that means a slightly higher percentage of them accepted the offer of admissions.
Than whites?
Than whites, yes.
Whites have more options.
They have more, they're higher represented at privates. Right, yes. So that's why we see that difference. And also, one of the things that we often talk about in policy is the reversal of affirmative action ban, and there's often discussions about that, and the DREAM Act, et cetera. But I think what we see here is that, while its effect might be important in the admissions of students of color, we suspect that it might have an indirect effect on perceptions of accessibility. In fact, that may be why so many students who are qualified to enroll, or to apply at least, to a UC are not doing so. And there may be this perception of inaccessibility. The other, the last closing remark is that I think University of California has a lot to offer for these differences in yield rates. We call it the enrollment rates. And it is, when we disaggregate this data by campus, there's some very clear patterns into which racial groups are more likely to accept offers of admissions at certain campuses over others. For me, that speaks to some indication about campus climate and what that means for students of color, whether they feel welcomed or not at certain campuses. But with that, I'll leave you with some open questions.
Thank you, Estela. There was one thing about that presentation that's totally consistent with the Harry Pachon Memorial, and one that was a little bit inconsistent. The one that's totally consistent is PowerPoint, right? Many memorials, people are going, hey, let me show you some statistics and educational achievement. That was really great. The inconsistent thing was it was kind of a bummer. What I'm hoping though is that Patricia Gandara from UCLA
Lose hope.
will help us resolve all this. So we understand that there's been somewhat of a small budget crisis in the state and it's affected the UC system, and I think you were asked to talk a little bit about what that means for all of these issues of mobility. She's one of the co-founders of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA.
Directors. First, let me thank my colleagues here at SC and the family for inviting me to be here. This is really an honor for me. And I accepted the first second. I said, you know, I'm teaching just for this. I'm not sure. I'll figure out the way, because this is a wonderful opportunity to reflect on a great man's life, contributions. And I think for all of us, too, who are teachers, you know, there's something wonderful about bringing this around to a discussion of those things that we have felt really dear to us and tried to impart to our students. And so one of the things I think of right now is, oh my God, we could use Harry. Because we're in a difficult time, we need the optimism, we need the insight, and we need the political skill. And we don't have Harry with us, and so the next thing I think is I hope Harry's students are stepping up. Because that's what every one of us who teaches hopes, that we're somehow contributing to a next generation that's going to carry this on. And so if we have any students here, I'm looking for you. I think we're all looking for you. He's left a wonderful legacy in you, and I believe the work will go on. Yeah, if I was invited to be optimistic, I got the wrong invitation. Yes, we are in a budget crisis, but I actually want to shift the discussion a little bit about this budget crisis. One of the things I think Harry would have very much enjoyed talking about today is the political strategy that is being used around this budget crisis. And then I'll move into the more depressing stuff. But just as an entree to the depressing stuff.
Has it been happy so far?
Oh, yeah. You know, what's happening right now with the budget crisis that we have is people are scrambling to figure out how do you make ends meet without getting people to step forward and say, I'm willing to pay more taxes, at least many people to do that, is that we're taking a lot of cuts, and we're taking cuts in really, really painful places. Very painful places. I don't think most legislators, of whatever stripe, are really feeling very comfortable about that. But around education, what has happened is that the cuts have come from higher education. And while we've had cuts to K-12, we had cuts last year to K-12, right now they're holding firm on that. And between higher ed and lower ed, it's higher ed that's on the chopping block. And why is that? It's because polling shows that the only area of the budget for which people are willing to pay additional taxes is K-12. Not higher education, but K-12. And so the strategy is that we say, if you pay more taxes, we won't cut K-12 again. But as a part of that strategy, it's let higher ed go. Harry was a graduate of the CSU system, California State University system. I think it is fair to say that had that system not been there for Harry, we may not all be sitting in this room together right now. Those of us from the University of California love to pay a lot of attention to the University of California and what happens there, and with good reason. But the CSU system serves 3 times more Latinos than the UC does. And about 90% of Latinos in the state go to public higher education. So this is where it's happening in the state. If you're going to get a degree, if you're Latino and you're going to get a degree, the greater likelihood is it's going to happen in the CSU system. And yet the CSU system has taken proportionately worse cuts than the UC system. It is struggling to stay afloat. And at the Civil Rights Project, we've come to think that there's not been enough attention paid to this issue. That the discussions have been around it, but not on it. So we, a few months back, engaged in, which we try to do, we try to find big problems out there and controversial ones that it's going to get everybody upset and go after them. But we decided that it was really time to do some focus on the CSU system and what is happening, really the backbone of the higher education system in the state for Latino students. We did a series of 6 reports, but the one that I'm going to say a couple words about, because I'm not going to try and go through 6 reports in 3 minutes, but the one I want to say a few words about is the one that we did in which we surveyed students and what the effect was on them. Because I think in the abstract, it's easy to think, well, it's a system, it's students, they're going to pay a little bit more, they'll work it out, they'll find a way, this will all work out, but it's not working out. What we found, we went to the Northridge campus because it is demographically very much like the system as a whole, very, very much like. And so in surveying the Northridge campus, we had over 2,000 students, almost 700 Latino students in that sample. We were able to get a picture, we think, of what it looks like across the state. What we found there was that about 80% of the students said, it's taking me at least a year longer to get through school. At least. 25% it's going to be 2 years or more. That's not trivial. That's foregone income. That's more debt. That is more chances that you're not going to finish. And I want to come back to that. What we found also was that the economy has affected these students and their families in really powerful ways, and it has affected Latino students more than any other demographic group. Half of these students, of the Latino students in the CSU system, were saying that their parents have either lost a job or have lost hours on the job. And now 40% of these students were helping to support their parents. So this isn't just about a little extra tuition. It isn't just about some readjustment of expectations. It's about young people who are caught in this crucible. They cannot move ahead themselves because of the increasing burden placed on them, and their own families are not only not able to help them, they are having to help their families. What are we doing in this state? What are we doing when we make these kinds of trade-offs? As has been pointed out before, the Latino population is the future of this state. It is the future of this nation, but it is also the future of the state. More than half of our children now in the public schools are Latinos. We are a Latino state. What happens to these young people matters hugely to everybody in this state. Another research organization about a year and a half ago or so did some projections on the need for bachelor's degrees in the state and concluded that California by the year 2025, and I think our demographer might tell us it could be sooner than that, will be 1 million BA degrees short of being able to meet its needs. 1 million. In other words, the jobs that are out there and projected to be out there will not be filled by Californians because there's going to be 1 million shortage of BA degrees. Whose degrees would those have been? By and large, look at the demographics. Those would have been Latino students. And if we don't fix that problem, if we don't solve it immediately, the National Center for Education Management Systems that looks at post-secondary systems across the country and does all kinds of projections, projected in 2005 that by 2020 in California, over the period from 2000 to 2020, our per capita income would decline by 11% in the state. These have enormous consequences for all of us. So I'll leave it on the happy note that unless we take very seriously what is happening across our higher education system, unless we place more attention on funding those kids so that they can fill those jobs, so that we can move in the other direction away from a decline in per capita income, our state is not looking at a very happy future.
Well, thank you for that. It wasn't a happy message there, Ken. And what I want to do, I think one of the reasons why Roberto asked me to moderate this last panel is that he knows that I operate by what I call reglas pastoristas, pastoral rules. You could start with a Latina, but you end on time. So I'm going to try to move it quickly with a couple of questions to sort of bring us to a close. And I want to start with you, Patricia. You've talked about the actual kind of impacts of young people in the Cal State system finding the inability to graduate on time, et cetera. What does it do to people's self-esteem, too? And there's a sense, I think, of a generation being thrown away. And what's the impact on the way people think about themselves when society is acting in those kind of ways?
In the survey that we did, we allowed people to write in something. Usually people don't take that opportunity. Almost everybody took the opportunity in this case. And the single word that appeared more often than any other word on these sort of optional write in your comments was stressed. Stressed beyond belief. Students said, I am a very stressed out student. I'm trying to pay the bills now and help my parents with the grants and loans that I have. But later on, I wonder if I'll be able to pay off the debt on the loans that I already have. They are worried, they are anxious, and we had a significant percentage of them that said, I'm not sure I'm going to keep going on. I mean, this seems like a bottomless hole. I'm getting more debt, I can't see myself getting out of here, I can't get my classes. So certainly anxiety, concern, and that doesn't make anybody feel good about themselves or their future.
Dell, let me ask you a different question. You've talked a lot about the need to make these investments so that we have a better future, both for Latinos and for the state. What do you think are the key things that need to change in our narrative and in our politics to get people to see the future and the generational and interethnic connections the way that you're laying them out? I mean, what's the key kind of political message, the key sort of narrative message that you think, from your talking around the country and trying this explanation out in so many different ways, what do you think really resonates?
Well, I testified up in Sacramento before a legislative committee there on master plan for higher education. You know, and what I told the folks up there, and they seemed to like it, but it didn't go anywhere afterwards, was that the master plan was really important for the kids, but forget the kids. It's actually far more important for the seniors in California than it is for the kids themselves, because it's the education system which is going to produce the replacement workers who are going to replace the aging baby boomers when they retire. It's the education system that produces the taxpayers who will return 3 times as much tax dollars as they cost in extra cost in education. And it's the education system which is also going to answer that deadly question which really worries seniors so much, which is who is going to buy your house? And in that perspective, it's not about the kids, it's not about charity, it's not about helping these poor deserving young things who are deserving, it's about the seniors themselves. And I'm not a political scientist, but I always heard that politics is about self-interest. So I decided in my book, Immigrants and Boomers, to write a book about self-interest. What's in it for the aging baby boomers? Everything. And I just would turn it that way. But I think that the problem is you have disgruntled older folks who feel they don't like the way California's changed. There's too much population growth. They didn't invite these people. It wasn't their idea, and they're sure not going to pay for them. And that's the mindset of a block of voters, not the majority, but enough to cause troubles. When you have to have a two-thirds majority, you don't need a whole lot to cause troubles. So turn it around. What's in it for them? And just present it only that way. And we don't do that because advocates for the young people present it for the young people. Present it for the old people. And I was trying to get AARP on board with this, but they got busy with something like healthcare. We got lots of problems that are competing.
Yeah. Now that I'm older, I appreciate this argument. Hey, Estela, for you, you talked a lot about statistics and where we see the breaks happen in terms of young people getting the opportunity to be prepared, making the application, getting accepted, etc. Students face a lot of the kinds of challenges that Patricia was talking about. Sure, when they get to the UC, they're facing a lot of challenges as well. What do you tell them, particularly given your own experience, right, to get people to move on and face those challenges and do what Harry would have wanted, right? People to really struggle and achieve.
You know, one of the things that I've observed in the students that I teach is that they actually don't need a lot of encouragement to struggle, because that's what they've been doing their whole life, and many of them engage pursuing an education at UC as they know that this is the battle for their life. I mean, they visited the campus, they know they're highly underrepresented, they understand the discourse around their presence there, so they're ready to go for it. I think I would probably, you know, if I had to give them advice, and not the faculty and others, if I had to gear it towards the students, is that I would tell them to keep an eye for what their career instead of just an education. I think in this time of age, when with budget cuts, tuition going above and beyond, I think some of our students are withholding from graduate school due to the debt they incur as undergraduates. And that's highly problematic, because graduate degrees are becoming all that much more important. And so,
particularly if you get one from the price school.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so when I come in with students is that, you know, this is it, I'm gonna need to quit, this is my degree. I give them some pointers on what classes to take so that they can get a good job after they graduate. And to make sure they take Econ 101 and statistics, and tell them this will set you up, and, you know, at least as an analyst somewhere. But to always keep in mind that long-term career goal, and that it does involve graduate school. And that becomes really difficult when we think about a lot of these students. If their parents have a $60,000 a year income, and we're telling them that that's the amount of loan they might need to take to pursue graduate school, and it becomes a luxury at that point. It can be perceived as a luxury. So my role is to think, you know, get them to think strategically about their education options.
Okay, so now for each of you, just 2 sentences, and then I'll do a bit of a close. What's something you feel like you learned from Harry?
How to communicate accessibly for everyone. I think he was a master of that. He could communicate with everyone about his research, and it was pretty amazing to watch him do that.
Dowell.
Try to have a bigger smile than I have, and to be he just seemed to always be non-threatening to people, so they would listen to him. And I'm too big to not be threatened. So, you know, but these are things I saw in him that I admired, that I couldn't do it like he could do.
You're big, but you're sweet.
I think in my case, I think I'm really appreciating the politics of education and needing to understand the politics of it if you're going to try and move an agenda.
Good. So let me close with a story and then wrap it around to answering that question. It's a story I tell at the end of a lot of different kinds of talks. It's my story. But like many other folks, my story actually begins with an immigrant parent, my dad, who arrived in the United States in the 1930s with papers that were imperfect. And when World War II came, he was given a choice between being deported or joining the U.S. Army to fight in Europe. And he couldn't figure out what to do, so he gave a penny to my cousin Carlitos, who flipped it. And the penny came up a particular way, and my dad and the penny went off to the war and both came back safe. And a generation later, his son is a professor at the University of Southern California, which would actually be a real achievement if I had season football tickets, but still, that's a pretty amazing thing. And that's a great story. That's an American story. And I think Harry would have insisted, as would I, that it's the wrong story. Because it's the wrong story, because if you tell it that way, what it sounds like is just a family and their gunness, their desires to get ahead. But my dad, in the 1930s, had no papers, but he had a union that protected his rights. And when he got back from World War II, there was a GI Bill. And that GI Bill, an act of public policy, meant that he was able, with a 6th grade education, to go to LA Trade Tech, which is just 2 miles away from here, and go from being a janitor, learn about electricity, and go from being a janitor to being an air conditioner repairman, and have the family go from being poor to being working class. And we bought a home in La Puente using that GI Bill, and it made it possible for us him to get a little piece of the American dream. And I went to public schools there because we were investing in them. And I got a chance to become, from a family of a dad who had a 6th grade education and a mom who had a 10th grade education, one of the first in our family to go to the university, UC Santa Cruz, because it was affirmative action to take a chance on a kid like me that did not fit the typical profile of who was supposed to be in the university. And that, I think Harry would tell us, is the American story. The American story is individuals and the expectation that they work hard and do everything that they need to do to get ahead. But it's also a story of public policy that makes it possible for people to realize their dreams. Harry Pachon was about public policy and about helping the Latino community and all communities realize their dreams. Let's thank this family.
Introduce now our closing speaker, Richard Cordova, the president of Children's Hospital Los Angeles and the former chairman of the board of the Tomas Rivera Policies.
What a perfect day this has, and I hope the family very much enjoyed the speakers today. As I was listening to the speakers, I was trying to take notes as kind of the closing of the highlights, but I have more lowlights than I do highlights. But I do have some things that I want to share with you. As Roberto said, I'm the president CEO of Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and healthcare is my kind of niche. And I kept thinking healthcare, and Dowell, you said something about healthcare, about where does that fit into this formula? And it really does, and I want to say a bit about that. But there's 2 experiences that I want to share with you with Harry, because as I listened to the speakers today, I felt very unfortunate because I only got to work with Harry, let's say, in the last 8 years. I missed all those years that everybody else had some wonderful experience with. But it was, is Leticia still here? Where's Leticia? She was the one that got me on the board of TRPI, and I think I was on the board for maybe 1 or 2 years. And then Harry came to talk to me. And if there's one thing about Harry, you can't say no to him. And he said, well, you know, your hospital is affiliated with USC. You know the campus very well. You know the hierarchy and how it all works. And you know we're going on this journey of transforming TRPI and moving it from a nonprofit organization into the university. And you would be the perfect chair to go ahead and work with this. After all, you know, I have a dean here that's kind of tough, and I have to work with him. So it's been a pleasure working with the dean on moving the organization from its nonprofit status into the university. And now to have Roberto Soto as a director is another major plus. It is a transformation that I believe is going to continue to do the good work that you heard today. It's phenomenal work that's going on, and we need to continue that work. So I want to thank the dean, the university, the school for the very much supporting this transformation that we're going through today. My second experience with Harry was in the area of healthcare, because I said, Harry, when are you going to do healthcare? There's huge issues in healthcare. There's still disparities in terms of access, in terms of quality, in terms of culture competence. And we kept talking about these issues, and he had his priorities, and I said, you know, we got to talk about this soon. But then time went on, and we did the transfer, and And I sit here now, and in conversations, Roberto mentioned this earlier today, that we've been in conversations about how we can better educate Latino families when it comes to their health care, because I'm a firm believer that unless they are healthy, you can't educate them. Unless they don't have the issues of lack of insurance. If they're not only healthy, but they are educated on their health care and the health care of their children. It's the next generation we need to focus on. So today I kind of want to announce something special, and that is Children's Hospital Los Angeles is going to give, hopefully this is the first grant under the new transformed TRPI, a $100,000 grant to study this issue about communication and patient communication, to make sure that we are culturally competent. And once we're done with this research, we want to make sure that this is for the children and the families. But when we take this research, we share it with every healthcare provider to make sure that these families understand their healthcare needs and that the instructions, and I can't tell you the experiences I have. My hospital, 65% of the children are Latino. And I can't tell you how many times they come back to us because the family forgot to give them their medication. Simple issues like that. So $100,000 starts to kick off the new TRPI. Thank you all for coming. It's quite a journey, and now we're going to start the new TRPI, and I look forward to working with them in the future. And I think now we're going to recess, and we're going to go to, do I hand it off to you, or do we go to the University Club where we'll have a reception, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you.